You're watching a carefully arranged interview when Wendy Osefo's oldest children appear on camera for the first time since their mother's conviction, and what they say breaks hearts across the country. The interview was conducted with appropriate protections for minors, including altered voices, obscured faces, and the presence of their therapist and legal guardian. Wendy's two oldest children, teenagers who had lived through the entire nightmare of their mother's arrest, trial, and conviction, had requested the opportunity to speak publicly about their experience. Their grandmother, who had become their primary caregiver while both parents served prison sentences, had agreed after consulting with mental health professionals who believed it might be therapeutic for the children to share their truth. The first statement from the eldest child was direct and devastating. "We're ashamed of our mother." The words hung in the air with a weight that reflected months of processing the reality that their parent had committed serious crimes. The shame wasn't just about the criminal acts themselves, but about the betrayal of trust and values that the crimes represented. Their mother had taught them about education, honesty, and integrity, while secretly planning and executing fraud for financial gain. The hypocrisy was impossible for them to reconcile. The children described the moment they learned about their mother's arrest. They had been at school when their grandmother picked them up early, taking them home to explain that both parents had been taken into custody on serious charges. The initial reaction had been disbelief and confusion. Their mother was educated, successful, someone who lectured them constantly about doing the right thing. The cognitive dissonance of learning she had allegedly committed crimes was overwhelming and marked the beginning of their world falling apart. Living through the trial had been torture for the children. They attended court on some days, sitting in the gallery and watching prosecutors present evidence that their mother had staged a fake burglary and lied to insurance companies. Each piece of evidence was another blow to their image of who their mother was. The text messages, the supposedly stolen items found in their home, the testimony from people their mother knew, all of it painted a picture of someone they didn't recognize but couldn't deny was real. The guilty verdicts had been expected but still devastating. The children described watching their mother cry as the foreperson read conviction after conviction, knowing that she would be going to prison for years. The finality of that moment, one understanding that their mother wouldn't be coming home, wouldn't be at their graduations or important life events, crashed over them with a grief that was complicated by anger and shame. They were losing their parent, but to her own choices rather than to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Most painful was describing how their peers at school had treated them once news of their mother's arrest and conviction became public. The bullying had been relentless and cruel. Other students called their mother a criminal and a fraud. They made jokes about insurance scams and fake burglaries. Some kids avoided them entirely, as if having a parent in prison was contagious. The social isolation and daily reminders of their family's shame made school a place of torment rather than the refuge it should have been. The children spoke about the anger they felt toward their mother for putting them in this position. They hadn't chosen to have a parent who committed crimes. They hadn't done anything wrong, yet they were the ones facing consequences every single day. The bullying, the whispers, the pitying looks from teachers, the knowledge that they were now the kids whose mom is in prison for fraud. The unfairness of bearing punishment for someone else's choices was a wound that wouldn't heal easily. Their statement about being ashamed wasn't just about the crimes, but about what the crimes revealed about their mother's character. She had valued money and appearances more than honesty and family. She had been willing to risk everything, including her children's futures, for fraudulent insurance money. The priorities that her actions revealed were impossible for her children to respect or understand. How could someone who claimed to love them make choices that would so completely devastate their lives? The children's description of their daily lives after their mother's conviction revealed the profound ways that parental incarceration affected every aspect of childhood and adolescence. The logistics of visiting their mother in prison were complicated and emotionally draining. Their grandmother drove them several hours each way for visits that were limited to a few hours in a controlled visiting room. The children described the dehumanizing aspects of prison visits, the security checks, the restrictions on physical contact, seeing their mother in prison clothing in a room full of other inmates and their families. Each visit was a reminder that this was their reality now, that their mother was a prisoner who had chosen actions that led to this outcome. The emotional toll of those visits was significant. The children wanted to maintain a relationship with their mother because she was still their parent despite everything. But they also felt anger and resentment that made the visits difficult. Their mother would cry and apologize, but the apologies felt insufficient for the magnitude of what she had done to their lives. They struggled with whether to comfort her or to express their hurt and anger, often leaving visits feeling emotionally exhausted and conflicted. Their relationship with their father was equally complicated. Eddie was serving his sentence in a different facility, requiring separate visits that their grandmother couldn't always facilitate given the time and distance involved. The children felt betrayed by both parents, since both had participated in the fraud. The fact that their father had gone along with the scheme rather than stopping their mother or refusing to participate made him equally culpable in their eyes. They had lost both parents to choices that both parents had made. The financial impact on the family was severe and affected the children's daily lives in concrete ways. Activities they had participated in before, sports, music lessons, summer camps, were no longer affordable. Their grandmother lived on a fixed income that was stretched thin by taking on the responsibility of raising 3 children. The family had downsized to a smaller home in a less expensive neighborhood, meaning the children had changed schools and lost the familiar environment and friendships they had built. Every aspect of their lives had gotten harder because of their parents' crimes. Academic performance had suffered for all the children despite their best efforts to maintain focus. The stress and trauma of their situation made concentration difficult. Teachers were understanding but couldn't make the fundamental problems go away. The eldest child, who had been planning for college, now worried about how to pay for it without parental support and how the stigma of having incarcerated parents might affect applications and opportunities. Dreams about the future felt more distant and uncertain than they had before. Mental health struggles were significant for all the children. Anxiety, depression, and symptoms consistent with trauma affected their daily functioning. Regular therapy sessions helped them process their feelings and develop coping strategies. But healing from this kind of betrayal and loss would be a long-term process. The therapist who accompanied them to the interview emphasized that children of incarcerated parents often struggled with trust, abandonment issues, and difficulties forming healthy relationships into adulthood. The children described feeling different from their peers in fundamental ways. While other kids worried about normal teenage concerns like grades and friendships and social events, they carried the weight of having parents in prison for fraud. The experience had forced them to grow up faster than they should have, taking on emotional burdens that children shouldn't have to carry. The loss of innocence and the premature awareness of adult failures and consequences had stolen something from their childhood that could never be recovered. Their grandmother's role in their lives was crucial and appreciated, but it wasn't the same as having parents present and engaged. She was doing her best while dealing with her own grief and shame about her daughter's choices. The children recognized the sacrifice she was making and were grateful, but they also mourned the loss of the family structure they had known. Extended family gatherings were awkward now, with some relatives distancing themselves from the shame, while others offered support that felt more like pity. The children spoke about how the experience had changed their values and their view of their mother's emphasis on education and achievement. They understood now that degrees and professional success didn't necessarily correlate with good character or ethical behavior. Their mother had 4 degrees but had still chosen fraud over honesty. The lesson was painful but clear. What mattered wasn't credentials but integrity, and their mother had failed the test that actually counted. The public response to the children speaking out was overwhelmingly sympathetic, with even those who had celebrated Wendy's conviction expressing heartbreak for what her children were experiencing. Kayarna Stewart's reaction to the children's interview was notably different from her typically celebratory approach to developments in the case. She posted content acknowledging that while she stood by her commentary about Wendy's criminal behavior, the children were innocent victims who deserved compassion and support. Kayarna's tone was somber as she discussed the interview, recognizing that these were real children dealing with unimaginable pain caused by their mother's choices. The humanity of the situation was impossible to ignore, even for someone who had been vindicated by Wendy's conviction. The interview sparked broader conversations about the collateral damage of criminal activity on families and particularly on children. Child welfare advocates used the case to highlight how parental incarceration affected millions of children across the country, many of them dealing with similar shame, stigma, and practical hardships. The high-profile nature of Wendy's case brought attention to issues that were usually invisible to people whose lives hadn't been touched by the criminal justice system. Mental health professionals discussing the interview emphasized the bravery it took for the children to speak publicly about their shame and anger. Breaking the silence around family trauma was often an important step in healing, though it required tremendous courage to be vulnerable about such painful experiences. The hope was that their willingness to share their story might help other children of incarcerated parents feel less alone in their experiences. Educational institutions were prompted to examine how they supported students dealing with parental incarceration. The bullying that Wendy's children experienced highlighted the need for better training for teachers and administrators about recognizing and addressing the unique challenges these students faced. Some schools implemented new policies about bullying related to family circumstances and created support groups for students dealing with parental incarceration or other family crises. The insurance companies that had been defrauded by Wendy issued statements expressing sympathy for her children while maintaining that prosecuting fraud was necessary to protect all policyholders. The statements acknowledged the difficult balance between holding criminals accountable and recognizing the innocent people affected by those criminals' choices. The companies announced donations to organizations supporting children of incarcerated parents, attempting to address some of the broader harm caused by crimes like Wendy's. Social media discussions about the interview revealed how deeply the children's pain resonated with people across different backgrounds and perspectives. Even those who had no sympathy for Wendy felt heartbroken for children who were suffering through no fault of their own. The comments sections filled with messages of support for the children and expressions of anger at Wendy for putting her kids in such a terrible position. The universal recognition that children shouldn't pay for their parents' crimes created rare unity among people who disagreed about almost everything else related to the case. Some critics argued that the children shouldn't have been given a platform to speak publicly while they were still minors dealing with trauma. These voices suggested that the interview exploited the children's pain for content and attention rather than serving their best interests. The debate about whether public statements helped or hurt traumatized minors reflected broader tensions about privacy, therapeutic disclosure, and the role of media in high-profile cases. However, the children's therapist who had supported their decision to speak defended the choice, explaining that the children had felt powerless and voiceless throughout the entire ordeal, and that having the opportunity to share their truth on their own terms had been empowering. The decision had been made carefully with consideration of the potential consequences, and the children had been prepared for possible negative reactions. The agency to control their own narrative was meaningful for young people who had felt like passive victims of their parents' choices, and viewers watching these innocent children bear the consequences of their mother's crimes found themselves confronting a painful question. When we celebrate justice being served and criminals being held accountable, how often do we fail to consider the innocent family members whose lives are destroyed right alongside the guilty? The impact of the children's interview on their relationship with their mother became apparent when Wendy responded through her prison's communication system. Wendy issued a statement through her attorney expressing devastation at her children's public declaration of shame. She maintained that she loved her children and that everything she had done had been motivated by desire to provide for them, though she acknowledged that her choices had been catastrophically wrong. The statement attempted to explain without excusing, acknowledging that her children's pain was her fault while still asserting her love for them. The defensive tone suggested that even in prison, Wendy struggled to fully accept the weight of her responsibility. The children's response to their mother's statement was coordinated through their therapist and their attorney. They issued a brief reply stating that their mother's claims about acting for them were insulting because no child would want their parent to commit crimes on their behalf. They pointed out that if she had truly cared about their well-being, she would have made choices that kept her present in their lives rather than choices that resulted in her imprisonment. The clarity with which they rejected their mother's justifications demonstrated how thoroughly her actions had destroyed their trust. Prison officials indicated that Wendy had been significantly affected by the interview, with reports of her becoming withdrawn and expressing distress about her children's public statements. However, the officials also noted that she continued to struggle with full acceptance of responsibility, often framing her situation as a result of circumstances rather than her own choices. The inability to truly own what she had done prevented genuine repair of her relationship with her children. The family therapist working with the children explained that rebuilding trust with their mother would be a years-long process that required Wendy to demonstrate through consistent actions that she understood the harm she caused and was committed to making amends. The children needed to see genuine remorse and accountability rather than justifications and excuses. Whether Wendy was capable of that level of self-reflection and change remained uncertain. Some observers criticized the children for speaking publicly about their mother in such harsh terms, arguing that it would make reconciliation more difficult and that children should maintain respect for parents even when parents made terrible mistakes. These critics suggested that the children were being influenced by others to weaponize their pain against their mother rather than working toward healing and forgiveness within the family. However, child development experts and trauma specialists defended the children's right to express their genuine feelings even when those feelings were harsh. Forcing children to maintain performative respect for parents who had betrayed them would be psychologically harmful and would impede genuine healing. The children needed space to be angry, to express their shame, and to establish appropriate boundaries with a parent who had caused them tremendous harm. Authentic relationships couldn't be built on forced forgiveness and artificial respect. The debate about what children owed to incarcerated parents touched on broader questions about family obligations and the limits of unconditional love. While many believed that family bonds should endure despite criminal behavior, others argued that trust had to be earned back after such fundamental betrayals. The children's public statement of shame represented their honest feelings at this point in their journey, and those feelings might evolve over time as they processed their trauma and as their mother demonstrated whether she was capable of genuine change. Eddie's relationship with his children was similarly damaged, though his situation was complicated by his position as the less dominant parent in the fraud scheme. Some observers suggested Eddie had been influenced by Wendy and deserved more forgiveness from his children. However, the children made clear that their father's participation made him equally responsible regardless of whose idea the fraud had been. Both parents had chosen criminality over their children's well-being, and both bore equal responsibility for the destruction of their family. People watching this family's painful attempts to process betrayal and loss found themselves wondering, when parents damage their children so profoundly through their own criminal choices, is forgiveness and reconciliation even possible? Or are some betrayals too fundamental to repair? The practical realities of the children's daily lives revealed how completely their mother's choices had transformed every aspect of their existence. School attendance remained challenging as the children navigated an environment where their family situation was known and discussed. Despite anti-bullying policies, the reality was that other students continued to make comments and jokes about their mother being in prison. Teachers tried to be supportive, but sometimes their extra attention made the children feel singled out in ways that drew more attention to their situation. The balance between needing support and wanting to be treated normally was difficult to achieve. The eldest child, now in high school, faced particularly difficult questions about the future. College applications would inevitably involve essays about challenges overcome and personal growth. How much to disclose about parental incarceration was a strategic question with no clear answer. Some college counselors suggested being honest about the experience and framing it as a story of resilience, while others worried that the stigma might affect admissions decisions regardless of how compellingly the story was told. Financial aid applications presented their own complications. The children's parents were technically still alive and should have been expected to contribute to college costs, but both were incarcerated and would have no income or assets for years. The unusual financial situation didn't fit neatly into standard financial aid calculations, requiring special documentation and explanations. The bureaucratic hurdles were exhausting on top of the emotional challenges. Social relationships had become complicated as the children tried to determine who they could trust. Some friends had stuck by them through everything, demonstrating loyalty that was deeply appreciated. Others had distanced themselves gradually, uncomfortable with the situation or pressured by their own parents who didn't want their children associating with kids whose parents were criminals. Dating was particularly fraught for the older children, as potential romantic interests often had questions or concerns about their family situation. The children described feeling like they were living double lives. At school and in social situations, they tried to present as normal teenagers dealing with typical teenage concerns. At home with their grandmother, they dealt with the reality of having parents in prison, managing visits, and processing ongoing trauma. The compartmentalization was exhausting and made it difficult to feel fully authentic in any setting. They were always performing some version of themselves rather than simply being who they were. Therapy remained crucial, but also highlighted how different their experiences were from typical adolescent challenges. While their peers discussed typical family conflicts about curfews and responsibilities, they were processing parental incarceration, public shame, and fundamental betrayal. The therapeutic work they needed was more intensive than standard adolescent counseling, requiring specialists in childhood trauma and family crisis. The children's relationship with their younger siblings added another layer of complexity to their situation. The youngest child was too young to fully understand what had happened, but knew that mommy and daddy were gone and that life had changed dramatically. The older children felt protective of their younger sibling, while also resenting having to explain or manage emotions that shouldn't be their responsibility. The disruption of normal sibling roles and the forced maturity required of the older children created additional stress. Their grandmother's health and well-being was a constant worry for the children. They could see the toll that caring for them while dealing with her own daughter's imprisonment was taking on her. They tried to be less burdensome, to need less, to cause fewer problems. But this resulted in them suppressing their own needs and emotions. The concern about losing their grandmother too if she became ill or overwhelmed added anxiety to an already overwhelming situation. The children spoke about how their mother's constant emphasis on education and achievement now felt hollow. She had pushed them to excel academically, to value their education, to work hard, all while secretly planning fraud that contradicted everything she claimed to value. The hypocrisy made it difficult to maintain motivation for school when the parent who had always pushed them toward academic success had destroyed credibility about what actually mattered in life. Observers listening to the practical details of these children's daily struggles found themselves reflecting, when we incarcerate parents for crimes they've committed, we're simultaneously sentencing innocent children to years of hardship they've done nothing to deserve. So how do we balance justice with protecting the truly innocent? The broader implications of the children's interview extended to policy discussions about how the criminal justice system handles cases involving parents with dependent children. Criminal justice reform advocates used the case to highlight the need for alternatives to incarceration in cases where defendants had children, particularly for nonviolent crimes. They argued that while Wendy's fraud was serious and deserved consequences, removing her from her children's lives for 15 years served punishment goals, but created collateral damage that might not be justified. The debate revealed tensions between accountability, deterrence, and consideration of innocent parties affected by sentencing decisions. Prosecutors and victim advocates countered that parents with children shouldn't receive lighter sentences simply because their choices would affect those children. Everyone knew their actions would impact their families when they committed crimes, and allowing parental status to reduce accountability would create perverse incentives and undermine justice. The consequences for children, while tragic, were ultimately the responsibility of the parents who chose criminal behavior. Family courts in various jurisdictions began examining how they handled cases involving children whose parents were both incarcerated. The unusual situation created legal and practical challenges around custody, guardianship, and parental rights. Some argued that long-term incarceration should result in termination of parental rights to allow children to be adopted by stable caregivers. Others maintained that maintaining family bonds was important even when parents were incarcerated, though this position was harder to defend when children expressed shame and anger like Wendy's had. Child welfare organizations highlighted the need for better support systems for children like Wendy's, who were being raised by relatives after parental incarceration. Grandparents and other relatives who took on care responsibilities needed financial support, access to mental health services for the children, and legal assistance navigating the complex systems involved. The support for these kinship caregivers was often inadequate, leaving families to struggle without sufficient resources. Educational equity concerns emerged from discussions about the impact on the children's academic opportunities. Students dealing with parental incarceration faced significant disadvantages compared to peers from stable families. Less parental support for homework and college planning, more psychological stress affecting concentration, financial limitations restricting opportunities. Some educators argued for special consideration in college admissions and financial aid for these students, while others worried about creating categories that would further stigmatize them. The interview prompted some prisons to re-examine their visitation policies and family support programs. Research showed that maintaining family connections during incarceration reduced recidivism and was better for children's outcomes, but the reality of prison visitation was often dehumanizing and traumatic for children. Some facilities began implementing more child-friendly visiting areas and programs designed to help incarcerated parents maintain meaningful relationships with their children despite the barriers. Mental health funding for children of incarcerated parents received renewed attention as advocates emphasized that early intervention could prevent long-term psychological harm. The children's clear articulation of their trauma and their access to therapy highlighted both the need for such services and the reality that many families lacked access to adequate mental health support. Expanding coverage for trauma therapy for these children became a policy priority in some states. The insurance industry used the case to advocate for stronger fraud prosecution while also acknowledging the human costs revealed by the children's interview. Some companies committed to supporting programs for children of parents incarcerated for fraud, attempting to address the broader social costs of the crimes beyond just financial recovery. The gesture was appreciated, though some critics suggested it was public relations rather than genuine concern for collateral damage. And observers considering these policy implications found themselves grappling with an uncomfortable tension. Justice demands that criminals face consequences for their actions, but those consequences inevitably harm innocent children who had no say in their parents' choices. So how do we serve both justice and the best interests of children? Months after their initial interview, the children's journey of processing their mother's crimes and rebuilding their lives continued with ongoing challenges and small victories. The children reported that speaking publicly about their feelings had been both difficult and therapeutic. The response from viewers and other children of incarcerated parents had provided unexpected support and validation that they weren't alone in their experiences. Online communities of people dealing with similar situations offered connection and understanding that their school peers couldn't provide. The sense of belonging to a community that understood their specific challenges was healing. Their relationship with their mother remained complicated and inconsistent. Some visits were more positive than others, with occasional moments of connection emerging through the pain and anger. Wendy's ability to take responsibility varied depending on her own emotional state and the pressures of prison life. The children had lowered their expectations about dramatic reconciliation and were learning to accept that their relationship with their mother would probably always carry the weight of her betrayal. Academic performance had stabilized somewhat for all the children as they adjusted to their new normal and developed better coping strategies. The eldest child was moving forward with college applications and had decided to be honest about the family situation in essays, framing it as a story about resilience and maintaining integrity even when parents didn't model it. The vulnerability required courage but also felt more authentic than trying to hide or minimize the experience. The grandmother caring for the children had found support through organizations serving kinship caregivers. Support groups and respite care services helped her manage the demands of raising teenagers while dealing with her own grief and shame about her daughter's choices. The financial assistance available through some programs eased some practical burdens. Though resources remained tight, her health had stabilized with better support systems in place. The children described ongoing work in therapy to process complex feelings about their mother, their family situation, and their own identities. The shame they felt wasn't just about their mother's crimes, but about being different from peers, about having to explain their situation, about the stigma they carried. Working through internalized stigma was an ongoing process that would likely continue for years as they moved through different life stages. Social relationships continued to improve slowly, as the children became more selective about who they trusted and more confident in setting boundaries. True friends had proven themselves through the crisis, and new friendships were built more carefully with people who could handle knowing about their family situation. Dating remained challenging, but the older children were learning to view their experience as a filter that helped identify people with genuine character versus those who would judge or reject based on circumstances beyond their control. The youngest child's understanding of the situation had grown as they matured, bringing new waves of grief and confusion as they processed what having parents in prison meant. The older children helped explain things in age-appropriate ways while dealing with their own pain at watching their younger sibling lose innocence and security. The protective instinct toward their youngest sibling was strong, but also an added burden they shouldn't have to carry. Plans for the future were taking shape despite the uncertainty about their parents' eventual release and what their family would look like years down the road. The eldest child aspired to work in criminal justice reform or child advocacy, wanting to use the painful experience to help others. The middle child was exploring therapy and social work as potential careers. The transformation of trauma into purpose wasn't complete or simple, but it provided some meaning to suffering that might otherwise feel entirely pointless. The family's financial situation remained precarious but manageable with support from extended family, community resources, and careful budgeting. The children had learned about financial responsibility in ways most teenagers didn't experience, understanding the real costs of basic necessities and the importance of living within means. The education was valuable but came at a cost of lost childhood innocence about money and security. Wendy's prison sentence stretched ahead with many years remaining before potential release. The reality that she would miss most of her children's remaining childhoods and adolescence had settled into an ache that was always present but no longer overwhelming every moment. The children were learning to live with ambiguous loss. Their mother was alive but absent. Their family existed but was broken. Love and anger coexisted in ways that wouldn't be resolved neatly. And people who had followed these children's journey from shame and anger toward healing and resilience found themselves reflecting on a truth that transcended this specific case. When parents make catastrophic choices that destroy their families, the innocent children left behind show remarkable strength in surviving and rebuilding. But the fact that they survived doesn't make what they endured any less tragic or any less preventable.